Like dependency theory, world systems theory is concerned with combating modernization theory, challenging neoclassical economic doctrines, and what Gurminder Bhambra has called methodological nationalism. But contrary to dependency theory, who operate within the framework of nation states, world systems theory takes the world system and the world economy as its unit of analysis and point of departure. And basically, world systems theorists argue that nation states operate in a kind of hierarchically organized interstate system, similarly organized along the lines of core, semi-periphery, periphery, which is characterized by this kind of economic and geographical unevenness. So in this graph, you can see that there's a kind of schema of core, semi-periphery, and periphery organized in a triangle where the different parts of this world system are linked together. So the core here is characterized by capital-intensive production, by advanced technology, by lower rates of labor exploitation, and higher wages for workers. The periphery is characterized by labor-intensive production, not too much advanced technology, and the reliance on exports for raw materials and primary commodity products. And there's also higher rates of labor exploitation here. The semi-periphery then is a kind of combination of the kind of economic activities that you can find both in the core and the periphery. And these sort of form a kind of triangle together. Now, world systems theorists focus on analyzing how these uneven international divisions of labor and flows of primary resources lead to a kind of drainage of surplus value from the periphery to the core countries. And they do this kind of analysis through a macro-historical approach rather than a conjunctural scope. That is to say, they do not focus on specific times and places, but on these long-term political economic processes and trends that unfold over long periods of time. And in doing so, world systems theorists seek to analyze and explain the internal logic, the functioning mechanisms, and the laws of motion, if we will, what it sees as a coherent, self-contained, yet unevenly organized social totality. Moving on to the work of a distinguished world systems theorist, and probably the most famous one, Immanuel Wallerstein. Wallerstein argued that the capitalist world system, the one we live in today, if you want to believe in the world systems theorist arguments, emerges in the long 16th century out of the crises of European feudalism and the collapse of world empires, the latter being characterized by unitary political structures, which in turn is different from the capitalist world system as seen by Wallerstein. Wallerstein writes that, quote, "A defining feature of a world economy is that it is not bounded by a unitary political structure. Rather, there are many political units inside the world economy, loosely tied together in our modern world system, in an interstate system. What unifies the structure is the division of labor which is constituted within it." So again, we see that this world system is largely defined through its economic activities and how they are divided on a global scale. So for Wallerstein, the central features or characteristics of the capitalist world system is, first of all, the integration of various societies into a transnational network of market exchanges and trade. And so the emphasis here is placed on the expansion of capitalism through trade and exchange, rather than the classical Marxist perspective, which focuses more on the point of production. Again, in Wallerstein, there's this kind of core semi-periphery schema, which is defined through the global division of labor. Wallerstein sees that surplus value is extracted and transferred from the peripheries of this world system through the core, through something he calls unequal exchange. And unequal exchange refers to the fact that economic activity in the core is organized along quasi-monopolistic lines for Wallerstein, while the peripheries are places where economic actors have to engage in fierce competition with one another. And in this scenario, the monopolistic side tends to come out on the stronger side, and thus they have a competitive advantage over the periphery. A third point in Wallerstein's theorization is his emphasis on these kinds of cycles of expansion and stagnation. And he analyzes these through a so-called Kondratiev cycle, which refers to the fluctuating process whereby the economy of this world system expands in what's called an A phase and stagnates in what's called a B phase at regular intervals between every 50 and 60 years, basically. And this expansion happens when quasi-monopolies can grow and can accumulate capital in a suitable setting. But at some point, a ceiling sort of comes, and then stagnation takes place. And this ceiling is referred to as a crisis of overproduction. When demand doesn't meet supply and price competition increases, which in turn leads to a decrease in profit rates. And when this kind of Kondratiev cycle ends, it never returns to the same point of departure. That is to say, because getting back from the stagnation phase to the expansion phase, you have to make some changes in the world system. And so this is a kind of cyclical nature of the world system for Wallerstein. Moving on to the kind of historical origins of world systems theory, rather. World systems theory has many currents and draws inspiration from a multitude of sources, dependency theory being one example, and Marxism being another. But I'd like to begin with an underappreciated early developer of world systems theory, or something like it. And that's from the work of Trinidadian sociologist / historian Oliver Cromwell Cox. And Cox basically argued that Marx failed to fully appreciate the international dimensions of capitalism. And for Cox, capitalism functioned through this kind of unified matrix of unequal social, political, and economic relations on the global arena. And for Cox, the seeds of modern capitalism are found in the Mediterranean trade, in the Italian city-states, and medieval Venice. But in contrast to Wallerstein, Cox believed that it was possible for multiple modes of production to simultaneously coexist with one another. So, for example, capitalist and feudal modes of production. But a much more sort of acknowledged source of inspiration for world systems theory is the work of French historian Fernand Braudel and the so-called Annales school of French historical thought. From here, world systems theory gets its sort of uni or multidisciplinary and macro-historical approach, and the idea that societies and economies should be studied in a kind of totality in all social arenas. The Braudel also has a strong focus on these long-term economic and political trends, and he also presents a strong critique against the kind of conjunctural analysis of historical phenomena. Here, capitalism is also seen as something that emerged in the long 16th century and as an internationally unevenly organized system. Braudel also developed his own theory of cyclical accumulation as a central feature of capitalism. But this was not used as much by Wallerstein. An interesting work I'd like to mention here is that by Gunder Frank and Barry Gills, who edited a volume titled The World System, 500 Years or 5,000 Years, which created a kind of big stir within world systems theory, insofar as it presented a kind of provocative claim that some kind of world system had existed for over 5,000 years, which caused a lot of debate. Now, moving on to some critiques of world systems theory. Briefly, the main points of critique here can be seen as the sort of expansive focus on political and economic processes at the expense of race, gender, epistemology, culture, and so forth. So a similar critique as was developed with dependency theory. Then there's the point that world systems theory arises primarily from a Euro-American context and an academic context, and does not have the same political and social commitments as radical theories from the global south. Some have also pointed out that the insufficient theorization of the global in world systems theory is a problem, and that capitalism has to be seen as something that doesn't just arise from a hermetically sealed and isolated Europe and then expands outward. More specific critiques against Wallerstein and his maybe Eurocentric side has been presented by Anievas and Nisancioglu in a book called The West Came to Rule, where they argue that the international division of labor as a concept is developed by Wallerstein primarily in a European context and then expanded onto the global scale. Then Anievas and Nisancioglu also point out that the transition from feudalism to capitalism is placed by Wallerstein solely within a European context, ignoring how similar transitions had occurred elsewhere before and after. They also point out that Wallerstein is unable to theorize the coexistence and interaction of multiple modes of production, which was something that Oliver Cromwell Cox did, as I remarked earlier. Now, before moving on to the concluding remarks, I'd like to ask you a question that you could think about, and it's like this. How would you situate the following countries, China, Brazil, Mexico, Russia, and Israel, in this kind of core semi-periphery schema? And I'd like you to think about this and please elaborate on your decisions. So, moving on to the concluding remarks, world systems theory and dependency theory, as we have seen, have much in common and they overlap in many ways, but they have important differences as well too. Walter Mignolo, a decolonial scholar himself, has argued that, quote, dependency theory was a political statement for the social transformation of and from the third world countries, while world systems analysis was a political statement for academic transformation from first world countries. So here we again see the sort of accusation that world systems theory is developed in quite a different political context, and as such is different from dependency theory. But in terms of theoretical substance, dependency theory had a stronger focus on Latin America and on the processes of capital accumulation after the colonial period and how they constrained peripheral development, while world systems theorists had a more global approach maybe, and their sort of temporal scope went all the way back to the 15th century, and in some cases to even earlier periods. But importantly, I think both of them converged in their critiques of modernization theory, in neoclassical economic doctrines, and also in pointing out some of the Eurocentric tendencies of economic theories developed in the global north. And I think this is probably the main legacy of dependency theory and world systems theory.